Greetings and welcome to the first real lecture of the semester. I've already told you when I went over the syllabus that I'm not very technologically adept. These lectures are being brought to you because I have a couple of wonderful helpers and I want to just give them a little bit of credit before I get started on my lecture. I have two wonderful colleagues at Merced College, an English teacher, Dr. Shirley Kahlert, and a psychology professor, Dr. Jeannie Clifford, who are helping me with the technological aspects of this. So, believe it or not, I don't even know how to make a PowerPoint. And probably given the stage of my career, I probably won't learn. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Welcome you to the course. I did teach the second half of this course last semester when the pandemic erupted, and students said it went well. The only thing there's a couple things missing from the face-to-face. Usually I'm a lot more entertaining in terms of humor and stories face-to-face because they're at Stanislaus are 120 or 125 people that I can interact with. At Merced College, there's usually 55 per class that I can interact with, and I'm stuck here at my kitchen table with this goofy, if you're wondering what's behind me, it is there's three ducks up there on the wall. I'm in my kitchen, I'm at my dining room table, and I'm looking at myself on a computer screen, so it's not very entertaining. But here goes. Here's the first lecture. First lecture, if you want a title for this lecture, it's The Paradox of Democracy. You can follow along in your notes, and you will note that the format for these mini lectures are going to be 15 minutes long. You can follow along in your notes. I will add additional things, but the essential things, for the most part, are going to be in the text and in the notes, but I will add some things that I think your book is missing, and sometimes I see some things missing in these notes that I've typed up. So your textbook, Greenberg, begins by talking about this concept of anarchism. Put some stars here. This is a test question that tends to come up. Anarchists believe that people are naturally cooperative and capable of creating free and decent societies without the need for government. So that's what Greenberg tells you in the text. But I would add a couple of things. First of all, he doesn't really go into much detail about why he makes this assumption. I would expand that. Essentially, what Greenberg is saying is that anarchists believe that governments, or I'm going to call them states, the state is a barrier to human progress and perfection, and that's why it should be abolished. What I would add to Greenberg here is the assumption that men are basically good. Ask the question, well then, how and why do they turn bad? And the anarchists usually make the assumption that people become corrupted by evil institutions. That could be government, it could be private property, it could be a whole variety of things. And so the anarchists believe that government in the state is bad. Greenberg ignores the other side of the coin, and I would add that if you take a look, for example, at fascists, somebody like Benito Mussolini, for example, the fascists make the opposite claim, and that is that people aren't good, that individual freedom that is extolled in democracies is a false value, and that true freedom is the complete subjugation of the individual to the state. Only through citizenship and through organization of the state can people define their potential and serve something greater than themselves. Now, Democrats are kind of in between these two, because what we're really doing is we're talking about two words, and I would write these down in the margin. When we're talking about the paradox of democracy, what we're really talking about is this competition between authority on the one hand, which is what the fascists are talking about, and freedom or liberty, which is what the anarchists are talking about. Greenberg doesn't say this, but he's implying this in the first chapter. I would say it much more explicitly, I think, even than him. And the way that I would put this as a Democrat, and here I'm not talking about a member of the Democratic Party, I'm talking about somebody who believes in the notion of democracy. And it's my belief that both authority and freedom are necessary to the good life. That we have to give up a certain amount of freedom in order to have order, a rule of law, and some notion of equity or equality. And yet, we know that historically majorities have abused their power, and that there should be a sphere of individual freedom for people to protect themselves from the majority. So, as a Democrat, collectively, I don't believe that people are either all good or are all bad. That government must regulate the state, but not all activity. And of course, that's where it gets kind of exciting, at least for me, when we get to civil liberties. For example, we'll talk about things like to what degree should people have free speech? For example, should the communists be allowed to advocate the overthrow of a democratic government? And the Supreme Court was highly divided on this question in the very famous Dennis case, Dennis versus the United States. The court was divided 5-4 on that very question. Democracy really cannot draw a hard line between the respective realms of liberty and authority, and thus our Constitution is designed to be flexible in interpretation to shift slightly in one direction or the other. So that's a kind of a long-winded, about a 6-minute addition to that very first paragraph, but I think that Greenberg starts off with a very good idea, and he doesn't elaborate on it very much. For the second half of this lecture, I want to go to that Roman numeral 1, the paradox of democracy, because I really do believe that democracy is a paradox. I'll read a bit and then I'll add to it. Democracy rests on assumption that may not be true, the equality of all members politically. Certainly, the notions of one man, one vote, and equal protection are compelling ideas that I would advocate. But certainly, if you look at people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or others who have been in the political arena in recent years, their criticism has been that true democracy only takes place when there is also economic and social equality, that it is not enough. It certainly is a prerequisite to have political equality, but a true democratic society also does not have extreme income inequality. If you have a country like the United States that has the greatest income inequality of any democratic society in the world, where a plutocracy controls the political resources of the state, then Sanders and others would say that we only have a facade or a mirage of democracy, and that and you've heard this in the last two presidential campaigns from Senator Sanders, that there needs to be a political revolution. And in this case, he's talking about democratizing the economic and social structure of the country, and not just the political structure. In my case, I want to go back to political equity with what you see as little number 1 and little number 2, and make a much more basic point here. And this is a debate that is very fundamental in the world of academia. If you read democratic theorists, you will see a divide or a schism between procedural Democrats. These are people that believe that democracy is primarily, and I know the note says is a means, but perhaps you should correct that and make it primarily a means to make decisions. And certainly we do a lot of this. We vote. We have nearly 100,000 governments in the United States. We have well over 500,000 people who hold public office. And certainly a lot of decision making occurs through voting in city councils, in county boards of supervisors, in state legislatures, and in Congress. The courts, certainly, if when we get to the Supreme Court, uh, there are 9 members of the Supreme Court. If 5 of them agree on a provision, then the Constitution means exactly that. And so it's kind of scary to think that in our society, a small oligarchy of 9 individuals decide what the Constitution is. And at any given time, it may mean very different things, and we will talk about that. Certainly, there is no question that this is part of what democracy is. Part of it is about decision making. Voting is important. Voting for elected officials is important. Making public policy is important. But in our society, not all issues are decided by majority rule. We have protections for the minority. And if you take a look at principled Democrats, these people do not deny that democracy is about procedure and that we do that, but they believe that at the heart of democracy is the notion that democratic countries protect certain values, principles, or freedoms. And so while the procedural Democrats want to stress majority rule, the principled Democrats believe in protecting the liberties of the individual. So we're getting back to that notion of authority and freedom, or authority and liberty, right? The procedural Democrats are stressing authority, that we have to give up a certain amount of our liberty to the majority to make decisions, to have social order. The principled Democrats emphasize liberty or freedom and are very, very leery about allowing the majority to intrude upon these freedoms. And so, whether it is something like speech rights or press rights or assembly, whether it is gun ownership, whether it is criminal protections, things like protection from self-incrimination or unreasonable searches and seizures, or the right to counsel, or whatever it happens to be. The paradox of democracy is that both of these are simultaneously true, that democracy is about both of these notions. Certainly through majority rule, we have a rule of law or authority. But we also understand that the government cannot impose whatever restrictions it wants. For example, one that I always like to use, and I'll close with this one. Once upon a time, Georgia passed a law preventing the possession of pornographic movies. The police caught Mr. Stanley, who had 3 of these movies in his house. Georgia arrested him and sentenced him to prison time. Mr. Stanley's attorneys made the argument that the Georgia state legislature, basically acting on behalf of the majority, did not have the right to pass a law like this, that the Bill of Rights protected him in watching these movies in the privacy of his own home. And in this particular case, the U.S. Supreme Court, by a 9-0 decision, and if you want, you can look it up. I'm going to talk about it later when we get to pornography and obscenity. But the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 margin in Stanley versus Georgia, ruled in favor of Mr. Stanley, saying that if the First Amendment means anything, it means a state has no business telling a man sitting alone in his own house what books he may read or what films he may watch. As to Georgia's contention that exposure to pornography may lead to crimes of sexual violence, Marshall wrote, given the present state of knowledge, the state of Georgia may no more prohibit pornography on these grounds than they may